The Bright Boy by Arthur Machen. Chapter 1. Young Joseph Last, having finally gone down from Oxford, wondered a good deal what he was to do next, and for the years following next. He was an orphan from early boyhood, both his parents having died of typhoid within a few days of each other when Joseph was 10 years old, and he remembered very little of Dunham, where his father ended a long line of solicitors practicing in the place since 1707. The Lasts had once been very comfortably off. They had intermarried now and again with the gentry of the neighborhood, and did a good deal of the country business, managing estates, collecting rents, officiating as stewards for several manors, living generally in a world of quiet but snug prosperity, rising to their greatest height, perhaps, during the Napoleonic Wars and afterwards. And then they began to decline, not violently at all, but very gently, so that it was many years before they were aware of the process that was going on, slowly, surely. Economists, no doubt, understand very well how the country and the country town gradually became less important soon after the Battle of Waterloo, and the causes of the decay and change which vexed Cobbett so sadly, as he saw, or thought he saw, the life and strength of the land being sucked up to nourish the monstrous excrescence of London. Anyhow, even before the railways came, the assembly rooms of the country towns grew dusty and desolate. The country families ceased to come to their town houses for the winter season, and the little theatres, where Mrs. Siddons and Grimaldi had appeared in their diverse parts, rarely opened their doors, and the skilled craftsmen, the clockmakers and the furniture-makers and the like, began to drift away to the big towns and to the capital city. So it was with Dunham. Naturally, the fortunes of the Lasts sank with the fortunes of the town, and there had been speculations which had not turned out well, and people spoke of a heavy loss in foreign bonds. When Joseph's father died, it was found that there was enough to educate the boy and keep him in strictly modest comfort, and not much more. He had his home with an uncle who lived at Blackheath, and after a few years at Mr. Jones's well-known preparatory school, he went to Merchant Taylor's and thence to Oxford. He took a decent degree, second in Greats, and then began that wondering process as to what he was to do with himself. His income would keep him in chops and steaks, with an occasional roast fowl, and 3 or 4 weeks on the continent once a year. If he liked, he could do nothing, but the prospect seemed tame and boring. He was a very decent classical scholar, with something more than the average schoolmaster's purely technical knowledge of Latin and Greek, and professional interest in them. Still, schoolmastering seemed his only clear and obvious way of employing himself. But it did not seem likely that he would get a post at any of the big public schools. In the first place, he had rather neglected his opportunities at Oxford. He had gone to one of the obscurer colleges, one of those colleges which you may read about in memoirs dealing with the first years of the 19th century as centers and fountains of intellectual life, which, for some reason, or no reason, have fallen into the shadow. There is nothing against them in any way, but nobody speaks of them any more. In one of these places, Joseph Last made friends with good fellows, quiet and cheerful men like himself. But they were not, in the technical sense of the term, the good friends which a prudent young man makes at the university. 1 or 2 had the bar in mind, and 2 or 3 the civil service, but most of them were bound for country curacies and country offices. Generally, and for practical purposes, they were out of it. They were not the men whose whispers could lead to anything profitable in high quarters. And then, again, even in those days, games were getting important in the creditable schools, and there young Last was very decidedly out of it. He wore spectacles with lenses divided in some queer manner. His athletic disability was final and complete. He pondered, and thought at first of setting up a small preparatory school in one of the well-to-do London suburbs, a day school where parents might have their boys well grounded from the very beginning for comparatively modest fees, and yet have their upbringing in their own hands. It had often struck last that it was a barbarous business to send a little chap of 7 or 8 away from the comfortable and affectionate habit of his home to a strange place among cold strangers, to bear boards, an inky smell, and grammar on an empty stomach in the morning. But consulting with Jim Newman of his old college, he was warned by that sage to drop his scheme and leave it on the ground. Newman pointed out in the first place that there was no money in teaching unless it was combined with hotel keeping. That, he said, was all right, and more than all right, and he surmised that many people who kept hotels in the ordinary way would give a good deal to practice their art and mystery under housemaster's rules. You needn't pay so very much for your furniture, you know. You don't want to make the boys into young sybarites. Besides, there's nothing a healthy-minded boy hates more than stuffiness. What he likes is clean, fresh air, and plenty of it. And, you know, old chap, fresh air is cheap enough. And then, with the food, there's apt to be trouble in the ordinary hotel if it's uneatable. But in the sort of hotel we're talking of, a little accident with the beef or mutton affords a very valuable opportunity for the exercise of the virtue of self-denial. Last listened to all this with a mournful grin. "You seem to know all about it," he said. "Why don't you go in it for yourself?" "I couldn't keep my tongue in my cheek. Besides, I don't think it's fair sport. I'm going out to India in the autumn. What about pig-sticking? And there's another thing," he went on after a meditative pause. "That notion of yours about a day prep school is rotten. The parents wouldn't say thank you for letting them keep their kids at home when they're all small and young. Some people go so far as to say that the chief purpose of schools is to allow the parents a good excuse for getting rid of their children. That's nonsense. Most fathers and mothers are very fond of their children and like to have them about the house, when they're young, at all events. But somehow or other they've got it into their heads that strange schoolmasters know more about bringing up a small boy than his own people, and there it is. So, on all counts, drop that scheme of yours." Last thought it over and looked about him in the scholastic world, and came to the conclusion that Newman was right. For 2 or 3 years he took charge of reading parties in the long vacation. In the winter he found occupation in the coaching of backward boys, in preparing boys not so backward for scholarship examinations, and his little textbook, Beginning Greek, was found quite useful in lower school. He did pretty well on the whole, though the work began to bore him sadly, and such money as he earned, added to his income, enabled him to live in the way he liked, comfortably enough. He had a couple of rooms in one of the streets going down from the Strand to the river, for which he paid £1 a week, had bread and cheese and odds and ends for lunch, with beer from his own barrel in the cellar, and dined simply but sufficiently, now in one, now in another of the snug taverns, which then abounded in the quarter. And now and again, once a month or so, perhaps instead of the tavern dinners, there was the play at the Vaudeville or the Olympic, the Globe or the Strand, with supper and something hot to follow. The evening might turn into a little party. Old Oxford friends would look him up in his rooms between 6 and 7. Zouch would gather from the Temple, and Medwin from Buckingham Street, and possibly Garraway, taking the yellow Albion bus, would descend from his remote steep in the northern parts of London, would knock at 14 Mowbray Street, and demand pipes, porter, and the pit at a good play. And, on rare occasions, another member of the little society, Noel, would turn up. Noel lived at Turnham Green, in a red brick house, which was then thought merely old-fashioned, which would now, but it was pulled down long ago, be distinguished as choice Queen Anne or early Georgian. He lived there with his father, a retired official of the British Museum, and through a man he had known at Oxford, he had made some way in literary journalism, contributing regularly to an important weekly paper. Hence the consequence of his occasional descents on Buckingham Street, Mowbray Street, and the Temple. Noel, as in some sort a man of letters, or at least a professional journalist, was a member of Black's Club, which in those days had exiguous premises in Maiden Lane, Noel would go round the haunts of his friends and gather them to stout and oysters, and guide them into some neighbouring theatre pit, whence they viewed excellent acting and a cheerful, nonsensical play, enjoyed both, and were ready for supper at the Tavistock. This done, Noel would lead the party to Black's, where they, very likely, saw some of the actors who had entertained them earlier in the evening, and Noel's friends, the journalists and men of letters, with a painter and a black-and-white man here and there. Here Last enjoyed himself very much, more especially among the actors, who seemed to him more genial than the literary men. He became especially friendly with one of the players, old Meredith Mandeville, who had talked with the elder Kean, was reliable in the smaller Shakespearean parts, and had engaging tales to tell of early days in country circuits. You had 9 shillings a week to begin with. When you got to 15 shillings, you gave your landlady 8 or 9 shillings and had the rest to play with. You felt a prince, and the county families often used to come and see us in the green room. Most agreeable. With this friendly old gentleman, whose placid and genial serenity was not marred at all by incalculable quantities of gin, Last loved to converse, getting glimpses of a life strangely remote from his own, vagabondage, insecurity, hard times and jollity, and against it all as a background, the lighted murmur of the stage, voices uttering tremendous things, and the sense of moving in 2 worlds. The old man, by his own account, had not been eminently prosperous or successful, and yet he had relished his life and drew humours from its disadvantages, and made hard times seem an adventure. Last used to express his envy of the player's career, dwelling on the dull insignificance of his own labours, which, he said, were a matter of tinkering small boys' brains, teaching older boys the tricks of the examiners, and generally doing things that didn't matter. "It's no more education than bricklaying is architecture," he said one night, "and there's no fun in it." Old Mandeville, on his side, listened with interest to these revelations of a world as strange and unknown to him as the life of the Floats was to the tutor. Broadly speaking, he knew nothing of any books but play-books. He had heard, no doubt, of things called examinations, as most people have heard of Red Indian initiations, but to him one was as remote as the other. It was interesting and strange to him to be sitting at Black's and actually talking to a decent young fellow who was seriously engaged in this queer business. And there were, Last noted with amazement, points at which their 2 circles touched, or so it seemed. The tutor, wishing to be agreeable, began one night to talk about the origins of King Lear. The actor found himself listening to Celtic legends, which to him sounded incomprehensible nonsense. And when it came to the knight who fought the king of Fairyland for the hand of Cordelia till doomsday, he broke in. "Lear is a pill, there is no doubt of that. You're too young to have seen Barry O'Brien's Lear. Magnificent. The part has been attempted since his day, but it has never been played. I have depicted the fool myself, and I must say, not without some need of applause. I remember once at Stafford." And Last was content to let him tell his tale, which ended, oddly enough, with a bullock's heart for supper. But one night, when Last was grumbling, as he often did, about the fragmentary, desultory, and altogether unsatisfactory nature of his occupation, the old man interrupted him in a wholly unexpected vein. "It is possible," he began, "mark you, I say possible, that I may be the means of alleviating the tedium of your lot. I was calling some days ago on a cousin of mine, a Miss Lucy Pilliner, a very agreeable woman. She has a considerable knowledge of the world, and I hope you will forgive the liberty, but I mentioned in the course of our conversation that I had lately become acquainted with a young gentleman of considerable scholastic distinction, who was somewhat dissatisfied with the too abrupt and frequent entrances and exits of his present tutorial employment. It struck me that my cousin received these remarks with a certain reflective interest, but I was not prepared to receive this letter." Mandeville handed Last the letter. It began, "My dear Ezekiel." and last noted out of the corner of his eye a glance from the actor which pleaded for silence and secrecy on this point. The letter went on to say, in a manner almost as dignified as Mandeville's, that the writer had been thinking over the circumstances of the young tutor, as related by her cousin in the course of that most agreeable conversation of Friday last, and she was inclined to think that she knew of an educational position shortly available in a private family, which would be of a more permanent and satisfactory nature. Should your friend feel interested, Miss Pilliner ended, I should be glad if he would communicate with me with a view to a meeting being arranged, at which the matter could be discussed with more exact particulars. "And what do you think of it?" said Mandeville, as Last returned Miss Pilliner's letter. For a moment, Last hesitated. There is an attraction, and also a repulsion, in the odd and the improbable, and Last doubted whether educational work obtained through an actor at Black's and a lady at Islington, he had seen the name at the top of the letter, could be altogether solid or desirable. But brighter thoughts prevailed, and he assured Mandeville that he would be only too glad to go thoroughly into the matter, thanking him very warmly for his interest. The old man nodded benignly, gave him the letter again that he might take down Miss Pilliner's address, and suggested an immediate note asking for an appointment. "And now," he said, "despite the carping objections of the moody prince, I propose to drink your jocund health tonight." And he wished Last all the good luck in the world, with hearty kindliness. In a couple of days Miss Pilliner presented her compliments to Mr. Joseph Last, and begged him to do her the favor of calling on her on a date 3 days ahead at noon, if neither day nor hour were in any way incompatible with his convenience. They might then, she proceeded, take advantage of the occasion to discuss a certain proposal, the nature of which, she believed, had been indicated to Mr. Last by her good cousin, Mr. Meredith Mandeville. Corunna Square, where Miss Pilliner lived, was a small, almost a tiny, square in the remoter parts of Islington. Its 2-storied houses of dim yellowish brick were fairly covered with vines and clematis and all manner of creepers. In front of the houses were small paled gardens, gaily flowering, and the square enclosures held little else besides a venerable, wide-spreading mulberry, far older than the buildings about it. Miss Pilliner lived in the quietest corner of the square. She welcomed Last with some sort of compromise between a bow and a curtsy, and begged him to be seated in an upright armchair, upholstered in horsehair. Miss Pilliner, he noted, looked about 60, and was, perhaps, a little older. She was spare, upright, and composed, and yet one might have suspected a lurking whimsicality. Then, while the weather was discussed, Miss Pilliner offered a choice of port or sherry, sweet biscuits or plum cake, and so to the business of the day. "My cousin Mr. Mandeville informed me," she began, "of a young friend of great scholastic ability who was, nevertheless, dissatisfied with the somewhat casual and occasional nature of his employment. By a singular coincidence, I had received a letter a day or two before from a friend of mine, a Mrs. Marsh. She is, in fact, a distant connection, some sort of cousin, I suppose, but not being a Highlander or a Welshwoman, I really cannot say how many times removed. She was a lovely creature. She is still a handsome woman. Her name was Manning, Arabella Manning, and what possessed her to marry Mr. Marsh I really cannot say. I only saw the man once, and I thought him her inferior in every respect, and considerably older. However, she declares that he is a devoted husband and an excellent person in every respect. They first met, odd as it must seem, in Peking, where Arabella was governess in one of the legation families. Mr. Marsh, I was given to understand, represented highly important commercial interests at the capital of the Flowery Land, and being introduced to my connection, a mutual attraction seems to have followed. Arabella Manning resigned her position in the attaché's family, and the marriage was solemnized in due course. I received this intelligence 9 years ago in a letter from Arabella, dated at Peking, and my relative ended by saying that she feared it would be impossible to furnish an address for an immediate reply, as Mr. Marsh was about to set out on a mission of an extremely urgent nature on behalf of his firm, involving a great deal of travelling and frequent changes of address. I suffered a good deal of uneasiness on Arabella's account. It seemed such an unsettled way of life, and so unhomelike. However, a friend of mine who was in the city assured me that there was nothing unusual in the circumstances, and that there was no cause for alarm. Still, as the years went on, I received no further communication from my cousin. I made up my mind that she had probably contracted some tropical disease which had carried her off, and that Mr. Marsh had heartlessly neglected to communicate to me the intelligence of the sad event. But a month ago, almost to the day, Miss Pilner referred to an almanac on the table beside her. I was astonished and delighted to receive a letter from Arabella. She wrote from one of the most luxurious and exclusive hotels in the West End of London, announcing the return of her husband and herself to their native land after many years of wandering. Mr. Marsh's active concern in business had, it appeared, at length terminated in a highly prosperous and successful manner, and he was now in negotiation for the purchase of a small estate in the country, where he hoped to spend the remainder of his days in peaceful retirement. Miss Pilner paused and replenished Last's glass. "I am so sorry," she continued, "to trouble you with this long narrative, which, I am sure, must be a sad trial of your patience. But, as you will see presently, the circumstances are a little out of the common, and as you are, I trust, to have a particular interest in them, I think it is only right that you should be fully informed, fair and square, and all above board, as my poor father used to say in his bluff manner. Well, Mr. Last, I received, as I have said, this letter from Arabella with its extremely gratifying intelligence. As you may guess, I was very much relieved to hear that all had turned out so felicitously. At the end of her letter, Arabella begged me to come and see them at Billings Hotel, saying that her husband was most anxious to have the pleasure of meeting me. Miss Pilner went to a drawer in a writing table by the window and took out a letter. Arabella was always considerate. She says, "I know that you have always lived very quietly and are not accustomed to the turmoil of fashionable London. But you need not be alarmed. Billings Hotel is no bustling modern caravanserai. Everything is very quiet, and, besides, we have our own small suite of apartments. Herbert, her husband, Mr. Last, positively insists on your paying us a visit, and you must not disappoint us. If next Thursday, the 22nd, suits you, a carriage shall be sent at 4 o'clock to bring you to the hotel, and will take you back to Corunna Square after you have joined us in a little dinner. Very kind, most considerate. Don't you agree with me, Mr. Last? But look at the postscript." Last took the letter and read in a tight, neat script, "P.S. We have a wonderful piece of news for you. It is too good to write, so I shall keep it for our meeting." Last handed back Mrs. Marsh's letter. Miss Pilner's long and ceremonious approach was lulling him into a mild stupor. He wondered faintly when she would come to the point, and what the point would be like when she came to it, and chiefly what on earth this rather dull family history could have to do with him. Miss Pilner proceeded. "Naturally, I accepted so kindly and urgent an invitation. I was anxious to see Arabella once more after her long absence, and I was glad to have the opportunity of forming my own judgment as to her husband, of whom I knew absolutely nothing. And then, Mr. Last, I must confess that I am not deficient in that spirit of curiosity, which gentlemen have scarcely numbered with female virtues. I longed to be made partaker in the wonderful news which Arabella had promised to impart on our meeting, and I wasted many hours in speculating as to its nature. The day came. A neat brougham with its attendant footman arrived at the appointed hour, and I was driven in smooth luxury to Billings Hotel in Manor Street, Mayfair. There a major domo led the way to the suite of apartments on the first floor, occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Marsh. I will not waste your valuable time, Mr. Last, by expatiating on the rich but quiet luxury of their apartments. I will merely mention that my relative assured me that the Sevres ornaments in their drawing-room had been valued at 900 guineas. I found Arabella still a beautiful woman, but I could not help seeing that the tropical countries in which she had lived for so many years had taken their toll of her once resplendent beauty. There was a wariness, a lassitude in her appearance and demeanour, which I was distressed to observe. As to her husband, Mr. Marsh, I am aware that to form an unfavourable judgment after an acquaintance which has only lasted a few hours is both uncharitable and unwise. I shall not soon forget the discourse which dear Mr. Venn delivered at Emmanuel Church on the very Sunday after my visit to my relative. It really seemed, and I must confess it with shame, that Mr. Venn had my own case in mind, and felt it his bounden duty to warn me while it was yet time. Still, I must say that I did not take at all to Mr. Marsh. I really can't say why. To me he was most polite. He could not have been more so. He remarked more than once on the extreme pleasure it gave him to meet at last one of whom he had heard so much from his dear Bella. He trusted that now his wandering days were over, the pleasure might be frequently repeated. He omitted nothing that the most genial courtesy might suggest. And yet I cannot say that the impression I received was a favourable one. However, I dare say that I was mistaken. There was a pause. Last was resigned. The point of the long story seemed to recede into some far distance, into vanishing perspective. There was nothing definite, he suggested. No, nothing definite. I may have thought that I detected a lack of candour, a hidden reserve behind all the generosity of Mr. Marsh's expressions. Still, I hope I was mistaken. But I am forgetting, in these trivial and, I trust, erroneous observations, the sole matter that is of consequence, to you at least, Mr. Last. Soon after my arrival, before Mr. Marsh had appeared, Arabella confided to me her great piece of intelligence. Her marriage had been blessed by offspring. 2 years after her union with Mr. Marsh, a child had been born, a boy. The birth took place at a town in South America, Santiago de Chile. I have verified the place in my atlas, where Mr. Marsh's visit had been more protracted than usual. Fortunately, an English doctor was available, and the little fellow throve from the first, and as Arabella, his proud mother, boasted, was now a beautiful little boy, both handsome and intelligent to a remarkable degree. Naturally, I asked to see the child, but Arabella said that he was not in the hotel with them. After a few days, it was thought that the dense and humid air of London was not suiting little Henry very well, and he had been sent with a nurse to a resort on the Isle of Thanet, where he was reported to be in the best of health and spirits. And now, Mr. Last, after this tedious but necessary preamble, we arrive at that point where you, I trust, may be interested. In any case, as you may suppose, the life which the exigencies of business compelled the Marshes to lead, involving, as it did, almost continual travel, would have been little favourable to a course of systematic education for the child. But this obstacle apart, I gathered that Mr. Marsh holds very strong views as to the folly of premature instruction. He declared to me his conviction that many fine minds have been grievously injured by being forced to undergo the process of early stimulation, and he pointed out that, by the nature of the case, those placed in charge of very young children were not persons of the highest acquirements and the keenest intelligence. As you will readily agree, Miss Pilliner, he remarked to me, great scholars are not employed to teach infants their alphabet, and it is not likely that the mysteries of the multiplication table will be imparted by a master of mathematics. In consequence, he urged, the young and budding intelligence is brought into contact with dull and inferior minds, and the damage may well be irreparable. There was much more, but gradually light began to dawn on the dazed man. Mr. Marsh had kept the virgin intelligence of his son Henry undisturbed and uncorrupted by inferior and incompetent culture. The boy, it was judged, was now ripe for true education, and Mr. and Mrs. Marsh had begged Miss Pilliner to make enquiries, and to find, if she could, a scholar who would undertake the whole charge of little Henry's mental upbringing. If both parties were satisfied, the engagement would be for 7 years at least, and the appointments, as Mrs. Pilliner called the salary, would begin with £500 a year, rising by an annual increment of £50. References, particulars of university distinctions, would be required. Mr. Marsh, long absent from England, was ready to proffer the names of his bankers. Miss Pilliner was quite sure, however, that Mr. Last might consider himself engaged if the position appealed to him. Last thanked Miss Pilliner profoundly. He told her that he would like a couple of days in which to think the matter over. He would then write to her, and she would put him into communication with Mr. Marsh. And so he went away from Corunna Square in a mood of great bewilderment and doubt. Unquestionably, the position had many advantages. The pay was very good, and he would be well lodged and well fed. The people were wealthy, and Miss Pilliner had assured him, "You will have no cause to complain of your entertainment." And from the educational point of view, it would certainly be an improvement on the work he had been doing since he left the university. He had been an odd-job man, a tinker, a patcher, a cobbler of other people's work. Here was a chance to show that he was a master craftsman. Very few people, if any, in the teaching profession had ever enjoyed such an opportunity as this. Even the sixth-form masters in the big public schools must sometimes groan at having to underpin and relay the bad foundations of the fifth and fourth. He was to begin at the beginning, with no false work to hamper him. From ABC to Plato, Aeschylus, and Aristotle, he murmured to himself. Undoubtedly, it was a big chance. And on the other side, well, he would have to give up London, and he had grown fond of the homely, cheerful London that he knew. His comfortable rooms in Mowbray Street, quiet enough down by the unfrequented Embankment, and yet but a minute or two from the ringing Strand. Then there were the meetings with the old Oxford friends, the nights at the theatre, the snug taverns with their curtained boxes, and their good chops and steaks and stout, and chimes of midnight and after, heard in cordial company at Black's. All these would have to go. Miss Pilliner had spoken of Mr. Marsh as looking for some place a considerable distance from town, in the real country. He had his eye, she said, on a house on the Welsh border, which he thought of taking furnished, with the option of buying if he eventually found it suited him. You couldn't look up old friends in London and get back the same night if you lived somewhere on the Welsh border. Still, there would be holidays, and a great deal might be done in the holidays. And yet there was still debate and doubt within his mind, as he sat eating his bread and cheese and potted meat, and drinking his beer in his sitting-room in peaceful Mowbray Street. He was influenced, he thought, by Miss Pilliner's evident dislike of Mr. Marsh, and though Miss Pilliner talked in the manner of Dr. Johnson, he had a feeling that, like a lady of the doctor's own day, she had a bottom of good sense. Evidently she did not trust Mr. Marsh overmuch. Yet what can the most cunning swindler do to his resident tutor? Give him cold mutton for dinner, or forget to pay his salary? In either case, the remedy was simple. The resident tutor would swiftly cease to reside, and go back to London, and not be much the worse. After all, Last reflected, a man can't compel his son's tutor to invest in Uruguayan silver, or Java spices, or any other fallacious commercial undertaking. So what mattered the supposed trickiness of Marsh to him? But again, when all had been summed up and considered, for and against, there was a vague objection remaining. To oppose this, Last could bring no argument, since it was without form or words, shapeless and immutable as a cloud. However, when the next morning came, there came with it a couple of letters inviting him to cram 2 young dunderheads with facts and figures and verbs in me. The prospect was so terribly distasteful that he wrote to Miss Pilliner directly after breakfast, enclosing his college testimonials and certain other commendatory letters he had in his desk. In due course he had an interview with Mr. Marsh at Billings Hotel. On the whole, each was well enough pleased with the other. Last found Marsh a lean, keen, dark man in later middle age. There was a grizzle in his black hair above the ears, and wrinkles seamed his face about the eyes. His eyebrows were heavy, and there was a hint of a threat in his jaw, but the smile with which he welcomed Last lit up his grimmish features into a genial warmth. There was an oddity about his accent and his tone in speaking, something foreign, perhaps. Last remembered that he had journeyed about the world for many years, and supposed that the echoes of many languages sounded in his speech. His manner and address were certainly suave, but Last had no prejudice against suavity. Rather, he cherished a liking for the decencies of common intercourse. Still, no doubt, Marsh was not the kind of man Miss Pilliner was accustomed to meet in Corunna Square society or among Mr. Venn's congregation. She probably suspected him of having been a pirate. And Mr. Marsh, on his side, was delighted with Last, as appeared from a letter addressed by him to Miss Pilliner, or, may I venture to say, Cousin Lucy. Mr. Last was exactly the type of man he and Arabella had hoped to secure through Miss Pilliner's recommendation. They did not want to give their boy into the charge of a flashy man of the world with a substratum of learning. Mr. Last was, it was evident, a quiet and unworldly scholar, more at home among books than among men, the very tutor Arabella and himself had desired for their little son. Mr. Marsh was profoundly grateful to Miss Pilliner for the great service she had rendered to Arabella, to himself, and to Henry. And, indeed, as Mr. Meredith Mandeville would have said, Last looked the part. No doubt the spectacles helped to create the remote, retired, Dominie Sampson impression. In a week's time it was settled. He was to begin his duties. Mr. Marsh wrote a handsome cheque to defray any little matters of outfit, travelling expenses, and so forth, nothing to do with your salary. He was to take train to a certain large town in the west, and there he would be met and driven to the house where Mrs. Marsh and his pupil were already established. Beautiful country, Mr. Last. I am sure you will appreciate it. There was a famous farewell gathering of the old friends. Zouch and Medwin, Garraway, and Noel came from near and far. There was grilled sole before the mighty steak, and a roast fowl after it. They had decided that, as it was the last time, perhaps, they would not go to the play, but sit and talk about the mahogany. Zouch, who was understood to be the ruler of the feast, had conferred with the head waiter, and when the cloth was removed, a rare and curious port was solemnly set before them. They talked of the old days, when they were up at Wells together, pretended, though they knew better, that the undergraduate who had cut his own father in Piccadilly was a friend of theirs, retold jokes that must have been older than the wine, related tales of Moll and Meg, and the famous history of Malcolm, who screwed up the dean in his own rooms. And then there was the affair of the poses plastiques. Certain lewd fellows, as one of the dons of Wells College expressed it, had procured scandalous figures from the waxwork booth at the fair, and had disposed them by night about the fountain in the college garden in such a manner that their scandal was shamefully increased. The perpetrators of this infamy had never been discovered. The five friends looked knowingly at each other, pursed their lips, and passed the port. The old wine and the old stories blended into a mood of gentle meditation. And then, at the right moment, Noel carried them off to Black's and new company. Last sought out old Mandeville and related with warm gratitude the happy issue of his intervention. The chimes sounded, and they all went their several ways.